Hello, and thank you for joining me on this video. I just want to take a few minutes to explain to you why we think that now is a great time to be buying property in Orlando, Florida, and why we're so excited about the potential of the properties that we're able to source for you. And I want to show you how you can benefit. And I think the best way to illustrate just how exciting this opportunity is to compare what's available in the Orlando market with what's available in the UK at the moment. So let's have a quick look at a couple of examples. Here's a property in the UK, and it's a 3-bed mid-terraced house which is typical of thousands of properties which investors have purchased over the last decade. Now, the owner purchased it about 3 years ago for £70,000, and it's now worth about £60,000. The tenant is on benefits and is paying £400 a month, meaning that if you bought it today, you'd get an 8% gross yield. Now, it's in an ex-mining town in the Midlands, and it's probably not in the best of areas. And in fact, when it was purchased, the tenants turned out to be drug dealers and were arrested. Now, over the next few years, I wouldn't expect any great capital growth. In fact, with the economic doom and gloom in the news at the moment, I expect the owner would be pleased if it just held its value over the next few years. By contrast, here's one of the properties that we can offer in Orlando. Now, it's a 1-bedroomed apartment, and if you bought it today, you'd pay only around about £41,000. In other words, 30% less than the terraced house. Now, it's let to a professional working tenant who's paying £520 a month, subject to exchange rate, which is 30% more than the rent on the terraced house, which means it's yielding 15% gross, or 8% net of certain costs which we need to account for, and which I'll explain later. It's in an excellent area, and this development is actually a gated community with 24-hour security, and it's got excellent facilities like a pool, a gym, a clubhouse, and much more. And in my opinion, there's excellent potential for capital growth. I can see arguments why the value could double or even treble over the next few years, certainly over the next 5 years, and I'll explain why in a moment. So let's just compare the two. We've got the property in the UK which is going to cost you about £60,000. It's in an area where you're probably not going to see very much capital growth. The tenant's on benefits, but it's going to pay you 8%. But then we can contrast that with the Orlando property, which is going to cost about £41,000, substantially less than the UK property. Is in an area where I think we can expect to see high capital growth over the next couple of years, and I'm going to explain why in a moment. It's in a very good quality development. It's a very good quality apartment. It's let to professional tenants, and this too is going to give you about an 8% yield. Now, I just want to take a few moments to explain why I think the USA is so exciting at the moment. Now, again, by contrasting with the UK, in the last downturn, UK prices fell by an average of 20%, but they've already clawed back about 10%. So if you didn't buy this time last year, you've probably already potentially missed out. But in the USA, prices for some properties in some areas have fallen by as much as 80%. But the exciting thing is that, as you have just seen from that example I showed you, these are not cheap properties. These are quality, expensive properties which are now selling cheaply, if you see what I mean. And I think that's a very important distinction. And these properties are going to give you high yields, but they're not going to give you the same management problems that you may associate with properties of a similar or even greater value in the UK. So why are properties so ridiculously cheap in the USA at the moment? Well, I'm not an economist or a financial expert, but I'd say that the answer is that they've got themselves into a bit of a mess out there. And let me explain what I mean. Just think about the high number of foreclosures. It was predicted that in the UK, in the whole of 2009, there were 47,000 repossessions. But in the USA, at one stage, they were foreclosing on, which is their equivalent of repossessing, something like 200,000 properties a month. 200,000 a month. And it wasn't just the banks who were causing chaos. There are many different types of home loans in the USA, including a relatively large number of what they call non-recourse loans, which is where the borrower can effectively walk away. And if you had bought a property for $300,000 with a mortgage of $200,000, and suddenly you had found that it's worth less than $100,000, I guess you'd probably want to walk away from paying the mortgage as well if you could, wouldn't you? Well, a lot of people did, and at one time so many people were sending their door keys back to the bank in the post, it became known as jingle mail. Add to that, but in some parts the banks have restricted lendings on condos or apartments, particularly ones at the lower prices, and this means that many properties are now changing hands at cash-only prices. Now the big question is, will this situation last? And to be honest, I don't think it will. Socially, politically, and economically, the USA just cannot afford to effectively exclude a large proportion of the housing market, and lending on condos will come back. And in fact, in January this year, Fannie Mae, the quasi-government lending institution, announced it was looking into ways to get the banks lending again, and especially on Florida condos. And when the finance is turned back on, I think prices will shoot up again. So why do I think that prices will shoot up? Why are values going to rise? Well, let me explain using some example figures. Now, US banks tend to lend using 70% loan-to-value ratios. And many banks will give a minimum loan of $50,000, which means, if you do the maths, they'll lend on properties with a price of $71,500 or more. So if a buyer pays the full $71,500, they need put in less of their own cash than if they negotiated a fantastic bargain basement price of, say, $22,500. And this is because if they agree a price of $71,500, they'll only need to put in 30% deposit. That 30% deposit is the only money that needs to come from their own money, which is only $21,450. So, buying for $71,500 means that they put in less money than if they negotiated a fantastic bargain price for cash. So unless a buyer is cash rich, it makes sense for them to pay at least $71,500 and to get a mortgage, and to then put in less of their own money. And this is particularly true of first-time buyers, who may have very little cash to put into a deal. Now, in my opinion, the prospects of significant capital growth when the market reaches some kind of equilibrium and a normality, plus the combination of the current low prices and the relatively high rents, means that over the next few years returns from this type of property could be massive. Let's have a look at our example property again. Today it's going to cost you just under $60,000. But compare this to the last time it sold, which was around 3 years ago, when the sale price was just under $219,000. And that's a 73% fall in value. Now remember, $60,000 is only around £41,000 in sterling, which I think you'll agree for a quality property is nothing. And when you think that this property last sold for just under $219,000, it's not hard to imagine that the value could easily increase to $71,500 or more. And even if the value doubled to $120,000, it's still going to be about $100,000 below the peak price. In other words, it's still only going to be half the value that it was 3 years ago, even if it doubles from today's price. And that's why I think that it's not only possible, but that it's highly probable that prices will more than double within a relatively short time. And even after they double, they're still going to be extremely cheap by historic standards. Plus, in the meantime, whilst you wait for capital growth to kick in, you'll get 8% on your rent net of HOA and RET. Now let me explain what those mean. HOA stands for Home Owners Association fees. And essentially this is a service charge on the community, so it will cover things like buildings, insurance, maintenance of common parts, looking after the pool, security, and that sort of thing. What we call a service charge in the UK. And the RET is real estate tax, which is the nearest equivalent of council tax out there. And it's expected in Orlando that the landlord will pay HOA and RET from the rent. So I've grossed down the figures so that we could compare with properties in the UK. So even after allowing for HOA and RET, a buyer is still going to be getting 8% on their money from the rent. And the icing on the cake is that you can even use the property yourself, should you want to, either between tenants Or if you prefer to use it as your own private second home and not rent it out at all, that'll be fine as well. There are many properties on top quality developments with excellent facilities which would make a great second home. So thank you for watching this video. In the next video, which I suggest you go straight to, I'm going to actually show you how you can find these top quality, high yielding rental properties in Orlando and how you can buy them at stupidly low prices. So I'll see you there.